Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It is me again, Zach, with our next Barony tier list. No longer talking about races or classes, we are finally moving on to game mechanics, specifically, in this case, spells. We're going to be doing this one a little bit differently. I'm not going to be going exactly in order here. I'm going to be starting with all of the damage spells first, and then moving into the utility spells after. Uh, Before we get into the meat of the tier list, there's a couple things. First off, I do once again have a Steam guide that I'm using as a reference sheet for a lot of the information I will be talking about here. Link, description, you know the drill. In addition, I think that we should talk very briefly about the way that spells work in the game. Not in depth, just very briefly. Essentially, every time you cast any spell in the game except one exception, you have a chance to get a magic and or casting level. The only exception to this is the light spell here, which will only take you up to a maximum of 40 in magic and casting. Now, previously, you were able to, let's say that you were level 20 magic and level 39 casting, and you leveled up to 40 casting. You would then still be able to use light to level up magic all the way to level 40. However, because one of your two magic skills were not, because both of your magic skills were not level 40, it would continue leveling up both of them. I think this has been fixed. I'm not sure, but I thought I read somewhere it had been fixed. I haven't tested that. But a general rule of thumb is, most of the time, if you're getting to level 40 in your magic stats, it's time to switch off of the light spell. In addition to this information, I'm going to note here that if you have a spell book, okay, of a spell, whether you can cast it or not, you can attempt to cast the spell from the spell book. So something like a goblin, which cannot learn spells, period, is able to still cast from spellbooks, and in fact the goblin ability that causes items to degrade slower will affect spellbooks in general, right? So that's pretty good. Spellbooks also have a chance, or not a chance, but also have a bonus effect when cast from. You can see this by hitting X over the spellbook generally. I'm pretty sure that affects all of them. I'm not sure, but regardless, if you hit X while moused over a spellbook in your inventory, it will tell you what level you need to be to cast it, as well as the general information about what chance to degrade it has, the chance to degrade when you're casting from it, all that kind of stuff. So, that all being said, the final note before we get into the meat of this is, of course, vampires. The reason I'm noting vampires is because vampires have access to the levitate spell. The levitate spell, which we will talk about later, is basically the light spell in terms of mana cost. What that means is that well, it's not quite the same, but if you're spamming it quickly enough, it is the same. What that means is that as a vampire, you always have access to a, what is it, tier 4? Yeah, to a tier 4 spell, which just means you have a really, really good spell that you can use to quick level forever that is also only ever 1 mana. With a decent source of mana regen, or really just natural mana regen, it's busted. If you're playing with hunger off, you can sit in on the first floor and just spam levitate in the corner and be maxed out casting and magic before anything else. In point of fact, I just remembered something else I should note here. The Dominate spell and Force Bolt are both given to people for free, to any caster for free once they get to level 100 in magic and casting, respectively. So keep that in mind. Now, let's get into the actual spells. We're going to start with Spray Acid, which I'll put here for now. not to be confused with poison, which I often make that mistake. Now, for the tiers, I'm not doing anything quite as nuanced as I've done for races and classes, because I really don't think that it's necessary with spells. Spells come in their own tiers, starting with tier 0, moving down 1, 2, 3, 4, and finishing with 5. There are also class-specific spells. They have their own tiers. We won't be discussing them in this video, but because they're not on this tier list that someone else made. But just keep in mind, every spell has a tier. The Spray Acid is a tier 4 spell. It costs 11 mana, and I'm going to immediately put it into C tier. Spray Acid is kind of a weird one, because when it is attached to the Insectoid class, it's more of an A tier. You get it from the beginning of the game, you don't really have anything else you want to use your energy, mana for, and it's pretty solid damage. But by itself, getting it later on in the game, it's just not that good. The damage is kind of mediocre. 11 mana is kind of expensive for what it does, and we can immediately contrast that actually with Bloodletting. Now, Bloodletting is the same tier, tier 4. It's the same mana cost, 11. It's attached to the vampire race, just at the start of the game, which is cool, I suppose. But the thing is that when you compare these, Spray Acid does damage over time and has kind of a cone shape. You can see the image does a good job of kind of describing it, where it shoots basically 3 blasts in front of you. It's kind of short range, but if multiple things are fighting you, it can be useful in that scenario. But overall, Bloodletting is basically this, but it does more damage, bleeds enemies, so it has the same damage over time, and also slows them. I legitimately believe that Bloodletting is either A or S tier. I think it's probably A tier. It doesn't feel as good to use in the late game, but it is definitely S tier if you're a vampire, because you get it for free at level 1. In addition, it causes blood vials to drop more often. In fact, if something is killed by it, it's a guaranteed drop, if I remember correctly. So, just solid across the board there, right? Next up, we have the Spell of Cold, the Frost spell, whatever you want to call it. This one is a tier 2 spell. 6 mana to cast, meaning it's about half the cost of Bloodletting, and has similar, kind of a similar role, actually. It slows and it damages. It doesn't have quite the overall power of Bloodletting, but I am actually going to move the cold spell up here. Because, first off, wizards get this spell starting off for free. Well, they get it in spellbook form, so if you're a goblin wizard for some god-awful reason, you can't learn it, sorry. But the point is that wizards get it for free. I think another class does as well, can't recall offhand. It's not that important. The important part is that it's great for kiting enemies early game. It's not super hard to learn because, again, it's a tier 2 spell, so it's accessible. It's relatively cheap as well. I'm not going to go over the gold costs of every spell. It's listed in the guide if you want to look at that yourself. You can kind of guesstimate if you go to a shop and you see how much a spellbook costs. You can kind of guesstimate like how expensive the spell you're looking for is, and you can take a shot at getting it. But it is cheap, both in terms of money and in terms of gold, which makes it pretty accessible, I think, throughout the game. Next up, we have Fireball, which I almost skipped in favor of Force Bolt. Fireball is another one the wizard starts with, and I don't think any other classes do, actually, but the Arcanist starts with a staff of Fireball. Fireball is a really solid early game damage option, and in point of fact, I think I'm going to leave it in B tier for this reason. But it's really good for kiting, but it doesn't have the slowing effect of Spell of Cold, so it requires slightly better spacing. That's what I'll say. The damage over time it applies via burning means that it outdamages this, and I think it's pretty comparable to this overall. using it to kill things like trolls early game, very easy. You just hit them once and then run away. Come back, hit them again, run away, and then they're probably dead. If you're playing on the higher difficulty, it might take 3, but it's still just very efficient as long as you keep in mind, like, you gotta hit and then leave. Hit and then leave, right? It's B tier because I prefer the utility of spells like this. And you may notice that Bloodletting is basically these 2 spells rolled into one, where it's got the damage over time and the initial impact damage of Fireball mixed with the slowing effect of Spell of Cold. But overall, they both have their places. Did I mention what spell level the fire spell is? I don't think I did. It's only a tier 1. It's 7 mana cost. Sorry. Overall, it's slightly more expensive than the Spell of Cold, but it's easier to learn if that ends up mattering to you. I don't think it matters for the wizard at all, but in the dungeon itself, if you find it, it can absolutely matter. Next up is Force Bolt. Force Bolt is your bread and butter. I think that it's fair to put Force Bolt here instantly. Force Bolt is a tier 0 spell. It costs 5 mana baseline, meaning it's the cheapest spell we've talked about thus far directly. And it doesn't do great damage. But the thing is, when you get your casting to level 100, if you don't have Force Bolt, you get it for free. And in addition, either way, it is now free to cast it. Right? Requires no mana. That means you have a spammable, solid damage option. If you are an int-based class, that int obviously raises your magic damage, this becomes a very reliable way to essentially use that stat attribute to deal consistent damage the same way that someone like a melee character might be able to. It does involve getting your casting to level 100 to have that kind of freedom, but overall it's still solid. It should be noted it's at the bottom of A tier because its base damage is very low, and if you're just careful with your mana management, a lot of other spells can be better. Like Fireball is obviously way stronger than Force Bolt. It's just that these spells, none of these are guaranteed. Force Bolt is, and because it becomes free when you get it, it's so reliable, I feel like it has to be an A tier. It should be noted, goblins can get this. Insectoids can get this, right? Classes that usually suffer, like even a Goatman can get this and get some value out of it, right? It's free infinite range damage. These are classes that normally suffer from the mage lifestyle that are able to benefit thoroughly from the Force Bolt, right? But moving on, next up we have this bad boy. Now this one is, what is it technically called here? Lightning? Yeah, Lightning. It's a tier 3 spell. It costs 6 mana to cast. It is probably most familiar to most people because it is what the gnomes use to fucking destroy you when you get to the gnomish mines. Lightning is an interesting spell, though, because I think it's actually kind of bad. I think I put it down in C tier. I've never gotten the lightning spell and thought, yeah, I'm gonna use this a lot, right? It has roughly the same damage as Fireball, like they're pretty comparable, and in fact pretty comparable to Spell of Cold or, I almost said Force Bolt, sorry, that's Bloodletting. Force Bolt's obviously a bit weaker, but like, its damage is comparable to these. And I feel like it loses out in terms of utility to these two, and in terms of raw damage because of the burning effect to this one. I think it's slightly better at burst damage, but I just don't find it all that useful myself. It is not D tier, simply because I think that, honestly, if you're looking at this from kind of the whole game point of view, right? The value you get from it in staff form in the Gnomish Mines is massive to the overall rhythm of your game, right? It keeps your tempo high. So I would still argue Lightning is usable. It's just kind of restricted to sort of the early game more than anything, in my experience. Next up is Magic Missile. This is one of the stronger spells in the game in terms of raw damage. It's also a tier 3 spell, slightly more expensive at 7 mana, but I find that it generally does a lot more damage, and in point of fact, I think I'm going to move it to a high B tier here, a little bit above the Fireball, which is funny because they both look like little tadpoles. Um, the the thing that makes Magic Missile special is just it seems to deal a lot of fucking damage, even when it is comparable to other spells. I always just feel like it hits really hard. It's relatively mana efficient. It's not super expensive even to just buy. It's just kind of good. I don't know. I personally have gotten more use out of Magic Missile than out of Lightning. Maybe that's kind of a placebo effect, but it is what it is. The next one up is Poison Spray. This one's actually a D tier. Poison Spray is in a weird kind of spot. It's good early. I guess I should note here before I talk about it in too much detail. It's a tier 2 spell, and it costs 5 mana to cast. The Shaman starts with a Staff of Poison, and that's pretty good for dealing with things like trolls. You kind of do what you do with Fireball, it just deals a little bit less impact damage and more damage over time damage. Overall, though, I think Poison is fine. It's nothing special to me, personally. I think that it is mediocre. It's usable, but it's almost entirely early game. Like, even comparing it to Spray Acid, which has a short range issue, I feel like Spray Acid is just better. Like, it has more use cases. And if you compare it to the single target damage options that are around, like, it just kind of falls short. It's not bad. It ain't great. I guess we could technically count this one. It doesn't do damage, though, so we're not going to. That is all of the direct damage spells in the game. None of them are S tier because I think they're all pretty closely equivalent. S tier is kind of reserved for the most powerful of all spells, right? Some of the ones that can break the game or are too useful or that kind of thing. So let's get into the utility spells here. Alright, first off, we have the Terrifying Face spell, which is the Confusion spell. Confusion is... I cannot find it on this list. I cannot find it. Ah, here it is. Tier 1. It's actually lower than I thought was the issue. It costs a decent chunk of mana. It's 16. It causes enemies to sort of fight for you for a little while. And the Joker class starts with it as an option. It's not super rare. I've gotten confused a decent number of times. Out of the crowd control spells, I think it's kind of weak, but it's not bad. I think I would rate it as a high C tier. If you start the game with it, it can be useful early on. The later the game goes, though, the more likely you are to just kind of want to kill your enemies instead of confusing them. So, it's a bit meh. Next up is Cure Ailment. Cure Ailment, obviously the healer starts with this spell, makes sense. It looks like a heal spell, come on. It is, in my opinion, an absolute D tier. Cure Ailment is a tier 1 spell that costs 10 mana to cast, not too expensive, nothing too crazy there. And its special effect is it just removes negative statuses from you. This is useful in one niche case, in my opinion. Well, not just one. It's useful occasionally, but most of the time, it just doesn't come up, is my problem with it. The niche case where it's good, though, is if you play as a Goatman healer, or as a Goatman on a team with a healer. Because Cure Ailment will remove your hangover, which is a nice little bit of synergy there. Other than that, I don't think it has much use. It's kind of whatever. Again, I'm not going to talk about the gold cost of every spell or anything like I said, but it actually costs more than getting the Spell of Cold, and between the two, I think you know which I would prefer to have. So, if you start with it, it's not the worst thing ever. If you don't start with it, it's probably only worth learning because reading a spell book has a chance to give you a magic level. Might as well do it right. Next up is the Dig spell. This is a tier 2 spell that costs 21 mana. I think that's the most expensive spell we've talked about thus far, pretty sure. It is a chunky cost, but it just means that your magic is a pickaxe now. And in Barony, that's pretty powerful. You basically get to play Minecraft. I'm going to move the dig spell to the top of A tier. Actually, probably here. Bloodletting is, I think, just absolutely top tier in terms of potential DPS. The dig spell, however, is one of the best utility spells in the game. It used to be one of my favorite utility spells more than almost any other. As time has gone on, I've sort of realized you don't need it that much, and especially if you're clearing the Gnomish Mines, you probably have enough pickaxes that it's not that big of a deal. But it is nice to have. Notably, for an automaton specifically, this is an S tier spell, because you can use it to mine out walls, to then eat rocks that you get from those walls, to then supercharge your boiler to regen more mana than it cost to mine out the walls. Pretty cool stuff, right? But overall, the dig spell mostly gives you access to some useful side areas and secret stuff. It's not huge, but it is in fact one of the better utility spells in the game, even up until today. Now, we're going to have to talk about it. We're going to have to talk about Dominate. I'm just putting it in S tier now. Dominate deserves its own tier, if we're being honest. I'm not going to do that, but it is, in my opinion, the most busted spell in the game. The existence of Dominate single-handedly undermines, again, in my opinion, it undermines the usefulness of the Mesmer as a class, and it weakens leadership as a skill because it exists in the world. What Dominate allows you to do is, with no cap, you can dominate and thus control as allies an infinite number of enemies. It is so powerful that the cockatrice kind of pseudo mini boss that exists in the secret area in the Crystal Mines has to be made specifically immune to Dominate. Right? That is too good. It's just crazy. Now, how likely an enemy is to resist your domination doesn't matter here. It's not like Charm. There is no saving throw against this. It's based off of the enemy's HP. Simply kite an enemy backwards, spamming Force Bolts, which are free at them, and lower them to low HP, then cast Dominate. It will take an amount of mana based off of their health and some other stuff, and then kaboom, you have a new ally. I will note here, because I haven't said it yet, it's a tier 5 spell. It costs 21 base mana, plus the target's HP. Alright, it's current HP, not max HP. It's sad, really, how good Dominate is. I don't think you can buy it, actually. But everybody that plays as a mage can get it, and even people who don't play as mage can get it. And it's such an incentive to max out your magic level that it's pretty much guaranteed everyone is going to try to get it, right? Why worry about your charisma? Why worry about your leadership score when none of that matters, because you can have an infinite number of followers from the Dominate spell? More importantly, why worry about playing races that have like cool alliance systems and stuff? Just be a vampire, reduce a bunch of cockatrices, crystal golems, trolls, whatever, down to low HP, and then hit them with Dominate, right? It's a strategy so powerful that I have to basically talk myself out of using it, purely because otherwise it just makes the entire late game too easy. Now, I'm not just here to criticize, okay? This is mostly a tier list. I don't want to take too long on any one spell, but I feel like this spell I need to talk about a little bit more. So I'm going to actually offer my uneducated, dirty peasant take on a balanced solution for it. I think that Dominate should have its own cap on how many followers you can have, separate from the leadership. Maybe like 3 or 4, right? Kind of small. You could even base it off of charisma, so then if you're like a wizard that doesn't have great charisma scaling, you can't dominate as many things as something like, say, a Mesmer, who has good int and good charisma, so they'd be a great caster and also a good leader, right? Same with like Conjurer and stuff. But giving Dominate its own leadership cap, separate from the leadership skill, would be, I think, healthier for the spell as a whole. It would really encourage people to still get the spell, but also to kind of base their playstyle around it uh, only when they have good charisma scaling, instead of literally anybody being able to have an army of 100 trolls. I will note a lot of higher level Barony players probably don't give a shit about this because there is maintenance to using that many allies, right? You got to be telling them to wait in a specific area. If you don't have good leadership, they won't listen to you for a while. The issue is that if you're dominating like 15 dudes, even if a lot of them die, they're going to kill some stuff, they're going to get some stuff done, you're going to get leadership levels, and then you're going to be able to tell them to wait in the main room, sleep when they get hurt, eat food if they need to, that kind of stuff. And after a while of just doing all of that, you'll have really high leadership anyway. So it just creates this constant momentum of just brokenness to it, right? Once you get the hang of the playstyle, if you're willing to put up with the maintenance and the micromanaging of your small army, dominate is just too good. That it fucks up the late game as far as I'm concerned. It's one of those strategies that's so powerful. Not only can it become a crutch, because like 3 cockatrices and a crystal golem or 2 will wipe the final bosses by themselves with minimal casualties. That's not great. And it's difficult to like deal with that problem if you make it so dominated enemies don't work in the final boss arena. That's a whole playstyle you've deleted from the game. That's a reward for a high level skill that you're just removing from the game, right? So it should still be powerful, and that's why I think putting a limit on it separate from the leadership limit would make the most sense, because then think about this, that makes the Mesmer instantly a little bit better, because they're no longer being outshone by anyone else who can also do this. A Mesmer would then always have more followers than anyone else, because let's say that a Mesmer and a Wizard both have the same number of dominatable allies, right? Let's just say it's 3. So the Wizard would have 3 dominated allies, and then let's say they have really high leadership, so they have 4 normal followers. 7 people in total, right? A Mesmer would then have 3 dominated followers. Let's say they also have a high leadership because, duh. They also have 4 followers, 7, once again, but then they'd also have their charmed super monster, right? So they would still have at least one more guy than other casters using Dominate, instead of Dominate just being uncapped, so any noob can just show up and be like, here's my army of 1,000 trolls, perish in flames, I guess. I don't know. That's my take. I think Dominate is arguably the strongest spell in the entire game. I think with even a little bit of effort, it is just objectively the strongest spell in the game. But we're going to stop talking about it. We'll move past it now. I know I've talked for quite a while, but it's just so much better than everything else. I feel like I had to talk about it. So next up, we have, Greater Healing. It's a little bit of a step down, but what level is this one? Where is this at? Hello? Oh, Extra Healing, there it is. Sorry. Extra Healing, Tier 3, 40 mana. The issue with heal spells, and I guess we can honestly just talk about both of them at once since they're right next to each other. The issue with heal spells is that they are not super mana efficient for what HP you get back from them. Until you get some mana regen under your belt, they just kind of come off as a bit mediocre. I'm pretty sure they start off 1-to-1, where Healing, which is a level 1 spell, costs 10 mana and heals 10 HP. Extra Healing is 40 mana and heals 40 HP. Now this is affected by things like your intelligence, so of course you can get more healing than that. But initially, it being 1-for-1 just doesn't feel great with how slow mana regen is in this game. Overall, kind of mediocre. That being said, they scale pretty well into late game, and because you don't use any extra mana for how many people you heal in multiplayer, they're way better. Extra healing is arguably in single player only. I would rate both of the heal spells kind of in C tier, honestly. They're fine, but in single player you get all the potions and all the food to yourself. It's not that hard to keep topped off, right? However, I'm going to rate them as if we're comparing single and multiplayer, and I'm going to say the normal heal spell is a low B tier, but the extra healing spell is in fact a low A tier. I think it's good. I don't think it's incredible. If you have even just one other teammate, you're getting double the value for the mana that you're expending on them. So I do in fact think that they are worthwhile at that point. Now, moving on past the heal spells, because there's not much else to say about them, is the Identify spell. Identify is kind of a high level spell, if I remember correctly. It does what it says on the tin, which is that tier 3, 10 mana. Actually, lower mana cost than I thought it had. It does what it says on the tin. You cast it, and then it lets you choose an unidentified object from your inventory, and it's identified. This is mediocre. I mean, it's useful on a handful of things up until you get 100 appraise. At that point, it obviously falls off the face of the earth. Generally speaking, the main use that I have for identify effects are better handled by scrolls in the early game, because all I really care about is using it on, say, an artifact helmet or gloves or something, so then I can use a scroll of repair on them. That's not really that useful with the spell, so while it can occasionally come in handy, I am actually going to put it in D tier. That was weird. It's high D tier. It definitely has uses, but I personally just don't find them very often. So, meh. Next up is Invisibility. Invisibility is sort of weirdly high for me, I think. It's tier 4. It's 2 mana to cast it initially, and then it's 1 mana per second to maintain it. It's fine. It's in kind of a weird spot, and in point of fact, I think I'm going to put it in high C tier because it is in a weird spot. For mages who have a lot of other things that they want to do with their magic, with their mana, I mean, it's not that useful because it drains your mana, 1 per second just for you to be invisible. But for classes that don't, it can be kind of okay. The Accursed starts with it, and a class like Rogue or Ninja even getting access to it, it's very powerful. On a normal mage, it's a bit more mediocre, so again, kind of in a weird spot. I personally don't usually get much value out of invisibility. I just don't find it to be all that helpful to stealth playthroughs. But again, if you are playing as a class that does not really care about their magic, like their spellcasting or their mana or anything, it can be pretty powerful. Again, much like Identified, this is something that is better handled by other items. Having an item enchanted with invisibility is way better than casting it yourself. So, meh is how I would describe invisibility. It's not bad. It has its uses, much like Confuse, much like Lightning. If you start with it, much like Spray Acid, it's very powerful. But outside of that, it's kind of meh. So next up is Levitate. We already talked about Levitation as being good for cheesing levels earlier in the video. It's a tier 4 spell, as noted. It costs 1 mana to cast it initially, and then 1 mana every 0.6 seconds to maintain, which is pretty good. Pretty good. It's spammable, and it allows you to fly. Being able to fly allows you to access a lot of late game secret levels, cheese some of the earlier levels, or even just avoid damage that you might otherwise have to take. It's also great for speedruns and stuff. It's actually going to go in low S tier. The level cheese alone is great, since anybody can do it, anybody can find the levitate spell. It's not that rare. Um, it's pretty powerful, and it's useful throughout the entire game, pretty much. Even in the final boss fight, having levitate might be useful. There are hazards there you may not want to fall into, like lava pools and an open abyss. So, why not? Light spell is the other leveling cheese spell that we also talked about earlier on. It is the cheapest spell in the game, I believe, because it is 1 mana to cast, and then it is 1 mana every 15 seconds from there, which basically means it just takes 1 mana away from your mana regen, functionally. It's also the cheapest spell in the game, being only 75 gold, which I just think is kind of funny. However, the actual utility of light is doo-doo. The light spell follows you. It does not emanate from you, and it does not follow you very well, meaning a torch is more reliable, and in fact, the faster you are, the less good the light spell is. Unironically, despite the fact that you can use it to cheese levels, it's going in C tier, and low C tier. I pretty much never use this for anything except early levels. I find it mostly just obnoxious. I'd almost rather not have light at that point. And you know what? Speaking of a spell that is really bad, just dropping it into D tier now. There's the lock spell, baby. Let's see here. Where is the lock spell even at on the tier list? Yeah, or not tier list, on the like spell level list. It is a level 1 spell. It costs 11 mana to cast. Now, if I can just remind you of something, reach back into the dusty tomes of the past, about half an hour ago, when I was talking about Bloodletting being 11 mana to cast and dealing massive damage, applying a dot, and also slowing enemies, and then look at locking, and what it does is it locks a door. Yay! So locking is kind of bad. You can... I don't know, it's kind of like in other games like Morrowind and stuff, right? Where you have the lock effect and you're like, okay, cool, what do I do with this? What is this supposed to be for? You can lock doors on enemies, you could lock doors on your friends, and I think they can technically level tinkering off of it, but you can't even do it that many times before, before you're out of mana. Like, it's not that cheap. You know, if it were really, really cheap, it might be useful, but it isn't. So it's not. So it's in the bottom of D tier. I think, honestly, it is the worst spell in the game. I personally have never, ever found a use for it. Ever. At the point where you are locking doors behind you to avoid enemies, just run faster. Or further, you know? It just doesn't come up very often. But next up is magic mapping, and this is a solid one. Magic mapping is another pretty high level one. It's tier 3, costs 40 mana to cast, which I think makes it now the most expensive one that we've talked about. I don't remember offhand. It's one of the most expensive. I think it's like tied for 3rd most expensive spells in the game. Well, that's not entirely true. There's some other ones that can be... We're not going to bother with that, though. Magic mapping reveals the entire map to you when you cast it. I don't actually know how that interacts with the new updates to the game, where you share your map revealing with your teammates. I don't know if that actually affects that at all. That would be interesting to test. I'll have to try that out at some point. Magic mapping is pretty handy if you're playing in a speedrun attempt. Every now and then it's nice to know like exactly where secret exits are and stuff as soon as you get onto a level. The prohibitive mana cost can be a bit intimidating early on, but late game, it's not that big of a deal. Once you have a mana regen item or two and you're pretty high level, it's not that problematic. It is a bit difficult to justify on certain races, most notably the skeleton and the insectoid. The insectoid, of course, only ever has 50 energy, so this takes all but 10 of your energy, which is rough. And of course, skeletons have very low mana regen, so again, can be kind of rough. For that reason, I'm not going to move it out of B tier, but I am going to put it at the top of B tier. It's good on most races and classes that can get access to it. There's a few exceptions, though, and it doesn't really help you win. You could see the entire map and still walk directly into a boulder sprinting at you. And yes, sprinting at you. So, mediocre, I would say. But it's high-end mediocre. It's very handy for most people, really. So I definitely think it deserves its B tier. Next up, we have the spell of Unlocking, which is technically called the spell of Open. It's the polar opposite of the lock spell. We're actually just going to immediately put it up into A tier, and in point of fact, I'm going to put it right here. The spell of Open, which I guess I should note here, hold up. Opening, there it is. Tier 1. First off, alright, we gotta talk about this. The lock spell, as noted, 11 mana. The open spell, 6. It's literally better in every possible way. Somebody, somewhere, on the Barony dev team hates locks, alright? They hate it. Or they knew it was always going to be bad and they just put it in the game anyway. The open spell is fantastic, because the open spell not only unlocks doors, but can actually forcibly open barred doors as well. Normally you can't lockpick those, they don't have a lock on them, they're opened by a lever somewhere. Magic doesn't care about that, it just opens it anyway. It allows you to bypass areas that really only the dig spell gives you an alternative around 90% of the time, which just means it's crazy powerful. Like it's wild. It's relatively cheap, pretty easy to pick up. You can find staffs of this as well, and it's always worth keeping around no matter what. The Sexton class starts with both of these spells. Actually, I think the Sexton class starts with Cold as well, come to think of it. No, it's not Cold, it's Sleep. Sorry, my bad. The lock spell, the open spell, is one of the go-tos for me. It's one of the best ones available. Starting with it on the Sexton is fantastic, but getting access to it at any point throughout the game is really good. Even a Tinkerer who wants to unlock most doors with lockpicks has a great time with the open spell, because again, you get to those barred doors and there's nothing you can do. Cast a spell. Kaboom. Easy. Next up is Polymorph. Polymorph is a tier 3 spell, and it is another 40 mana cost spell. It's relatively expensive, but what it allows you to do is, if you're a human, it transforms you into a random monster, and if you are a non-human of any kind, it transforms you into a human. For humans, this is a D tier spell. It doesn't do anything for you, really, but for monsters, it's very helpful. Now, the most important thing to remember here, Polymorph only lasts for a set amount of time, and it dissipates if you touch water in any way. So keep that in mind. Don't go swimming. This makes it a little bit dangerous to use this in the goblin area where there's a lot of water, but it does allow monster races to trade with shopkeepers, which has some value. The Succubus starts with this as one of their 2 racial spells. It's not a unique spell to them, though. It can be found in the world. It's kind of rare. Potions are pretty common of it, but the actual spell itself is pretty rare. If you get access to it and you're a monster, though, it's very helpful. If you're a human, again, not that helpful. You could hypothetically use the Polymorph spell to turn into a monster, attack a shopkeeper, kill them, and not accrue a bounty or anything like that from other shopkeepers. By and large, I think it's kind of at the top of C tier. I'm inclined to put it into B tier, but I think that's my Succubus bias, so I'm not going to. I think I'm good with this where it's at. I believe that this symbol here is the Amplify Magic thing, but it looks like the Spell Deflection? No, I think that is Reflect Magic, actually. I've never seen this spell in-game. That's what I'm going to say about this one. According to the list, it's a tier 2 spell that costs 10 mana to cast, and then 1 mana every 6 seconds to maintain. I mean, if that's true, it's pretty powerful. That's pretty good. I've never seen it, so I'm going to leave it off the list. But if no, I'll put it somewhere. I would put this in like really low B tier. Magic is not that common of a threat throughout most of the dungeon. It's really good against bosses though. So I think if you were, I mean, it's only a tier 2 spell. If you were like a melee boy with not, or even a ranged boy without a ton of like magic and casting levels, but just enough to learn this, you could cast this and just use your small amount of mana to maintain it during a fight, and save yourself on some of the reflect magic items you might have picked up, which that's kind of useful, right? Low B tier. I've never seen it once, though. In hundreds of hours of playing Barony, not once have I laid eyes on this spell that I can remember. And if I can't remember it, that's a bad sign too. So the next one is Remove Curse, and this one is a bit of a mixed bag and might even be controversial where I'm going to put it. But I think that I'm actually going to put it at the bottom of A tier. I feel like this is one of those ones you don't really need. It could really go anywhere, but I think that the potential for it is really high. So if I look here, the Remove Curse spell is a tier 3, 20 mana cost spell, much like with the Identify spell that we talked about earlier. You can cast this and then opens your inventory and gives you an option to click on anything you want to remove the curse from, so you can pick very carefully. If you get this spell early, it can be kind of helpful when you're still kind of picking through items that may or may not be cursed. Same with Identify, but I think it has more staying power because if you are a character, just as an example, if you're a ninja and you've gone all in on swords and you don't find any swords for a long time and then you find one and it's cursed, this might save your run rather than forcing you to have to like switch over to polearms or axes or something. Is it the most useful effect? No. I definitely think you could knock it down a tier or even all the way down to the bottom tier if you were like you know, playing as certain races, most notably Succubus and Incubus, of course, but even like Automaton doesn't really care about cursed items. They can remove them if they need to, and they can just eat them. So it's a mixed bag. I do think that it is one of those ones, though, when you need it, you really need it. So it stays up there. Next up, Detect Food. Detect Food is available to the rat form of the Shaman, I think at level 1. It is a tier 2 spell, and it is 14 mana to cast it. It is not that good. I'm going to put it down here. It's at the top of D tier. Sometimes being able to cast that and find food is good. And for the Shaman, you can kind of spam that effect a little bit early on to get a handful of levels. It's not super reliable, but it's there. It's an option for you. For other people, it's mediocre. For vampires and automatons, it's outright kind of worthless. As far as I know, the effectiveness of it goes up slightly when you're playing with hunger turned on, but again, I think it's kind of mediocre, personally. So I'm going to leave it down in D tier. I do think it comes in slightly more handy than these other ones most of the time, but still. Next up is Sleep. Sleep is one of the best spells in the game. I'm just going to move it to S tier immediately. I think Sleep is fantastic. It's a tier 1 spell, costs 4 mana to cast, puts the enemy to sleep. Some enemies, I think, are completely unaffected by this. Obviously, bosses and stuff are. So it's not the strongest spell in the game, period. But out of the crowd control spells, it is, in fact, the best one. There's only one other spell that comes kind of close to it, and it's so unreliable that it's not even worth thinking about. Sleep is reasonably common. It's also very cheap. It's only 175 gold baseline, which is crazy, because that makes it not that much more expensive than our next contender, which is infinitely weaker. Sleep just puts an enemy to sleep. You can just do whatever you want from there. Obviously, if you attack them, they wake up, but you can just walk back and hit them with a ranged move. Going back to the Sexton that I mentioned with the open spell, they start with sleep as an option, and they start with chakrams. Chakrams do not have infinite ammo, they are thrown items. So what you can do is toss 2 chakrams at a troll, wait till he gets close, throw the third one, chuck down a sleep, pick up your chakrams while the troll's sleeping, repeat, over and over again. If you're playing in multiplayer, the effectiveness of the spell only goes up because you can use it to save your friends from trolls they might have pissed off without thinking about it. You can use it in the gnomish mines to, possibly juggle gnomes and stuff. You can use it throughout the early game, but also in the late game, you're still going to be running into enemies that you're like, no, I don't want to deal with you, sleep you. And even though it doesn't do any damage by itself, it actually helps with the Dominate spell, because you can get an enemy kind of low, hit him with the sleep, and then kind of like gauge for yourself. If you're trying to go kind of slow and careful, you can kind of gauge for yourself like, oh man, I have this much mana, they have barely any health, I'm probably good to try the Dominate now. That kind of thing, right? It's pretty powerful. Sleep is good. It doesn't have the leveling cheese of Levitate, and it doesn't have quite the utility usefulness of Levitate, nor is it as wildly busted as Dominate, but while I think it's at the bottom of S tier, I think it's a very solid spell. Next up, we have Slow. Slow is also a tier 1 spell. It costs exactly the same amount as Sleep, and all it does is slow the enemy down a little bit. This will probably not surprise you. It's going in D tier. No, I'm just kidding. It's going in C tier, but at the bottom, pretty much. It's not good. Early game, it can be helpful. The healer starts with a Staff of Slow? Yeah, the Staff of Slow. I think the Conjurer starts with a Spellbook of Slow, so they can both get some extra use out of it. But by and large, if you have the option to get like Spell of Cold or Bloodletting or Sleep, Slow is mostly worthless. It just doesn't really do anything for you. If you can't get access to those and you do have Slow, it is worth keeping though. It is useful. You can do a lightweight version of the sleep kiting technique I was just talking about with the slow spell by hitting an enemy, hitting them with a couple ranged attacks. When slow's about to wear off, hit them again, that kind of thing. It's not great, but it's something. It's low level because it's only really handy at lower levels. That's all. After that point, you're almost certainly going to have one of the better spells, or you just won't need it anymore. Next up is Speed. Speed's kind of a weird one for me. I actually feel like I don't get much value out of Speed, even when I have access to it. It's a tier 2 spell, costs 11 mana. Again, we know what else costs 11 mana, and I mean, it just doesn't... It doesn't stack up incredibly well. Speed's big thing that I will note, well, 2 things, is A, it does hit in an AoE. So that is pretty good. You can affect your whole team with it. The second thing is that the Shaman's Rat form gets this at, I think, level 7 or something like that. So, getting it for free is pretty cool, but overall, I am going to put it in D tier, and I'm actually going to put it, I think, here. I just personally don't find it to be that useful. I don't know, maybe there are some speedrunning strats or something that use speed, but generally speaking, I find that my own natural speed is better, and if I'm doing inventory management correctly, I don't need to go any faster than that. So, meh. It doesn't really help you win fights or anything either. Next one up is Stoneblood, which I always want to call Paralysis, because functionally that's what it is. It's a tier 4 spell, and it costs... how much was it? It costs 21 mana to cast. It is, I think, the top of B tier. The issue with it is I never see it. But it is a triple-pronged paralysis blast, similar to Spray Acid, but with a paralyzing effect instead. That's pretty strong, that's pretty powerful. Paralysis is good. You know what else has paralysis? Bear traps. You could just get bear traps. Functionally, a ninja starts with this built in by having 3 bear traps on them. Functionally, a mechanist starts with this built in because they can just build bear traps. It's mediocre, but it's not bad. It can be very strong if you happen to get it early. There are a lot of staffs of this late game. Generally speaking, though, I think that it's kind of mediocre. It honestly might even be lower than this. Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I'm happier with it there. It is a powerful CC effect, but by the time you get it, 90% of the time, by the time you get it, 90% of the time, it's useless, or at least not as useful. So the final spell on this list is Teleport. Now, Teleport, or Teleportation, is a tier 4 spell. It costs 20 mana to cast. This spell is a real mixed bag. Sometimes being able to cast Teleport can be really helpful for getting you away from enemies who might otherwise have killed you, but 99% of the time, because you cannot choose where you teleport, it just always takes you somewhere else. It's not good. So I'm just going to drop it down here. It's towards the top of D tier, I think, but you know what? No. Honestly, I think these three spells, and in fact, I'm going to move Detect Food there. I think these spells all have uses. I don't see these ones having much, personally. But overall, Teleport, like, it's just not very good. The Incubus and Succubus both get Teleport spells attached to them. I believe... Yeah, the Punisher class gets access to the Teleport Other spell. The Incubus gets access to the Arcane Mark spell, which allows you to teleport to an enemy that you've marked with it. You appear behind them, if I remember correctly, which allows you to get a sneak attack. But outside of that kind of weird pseudo playstyle, there's really not much to be said about Teleport. Succubus, I think, gets no value out of it, really. And Incubus only gets a little bit of value out of it. It does have some usefulness, but by and large, it's not that great, and you can find so many items with this attached to it. Learning the spell and using actual mana on it is just kind of worthless. Now, there are some spells that are not listed on here, such as Arcane Mark, Salvage, Charm Monster, the Vampiric Aura effect, which becomes a toggleable ability for the Accursed, if I remember correctly. And Steel Weapon is not on here, which I don't know how you even get Steel Weapon. I've never seen it, I don't think. And there's a couple others, such as the different forms of the Shaman, and the Conjure Skeleton, Inner Demon, Drain Soul, different class-specific innate spells and such. Those ones are so tied to their respective classes and or races, though, it would be difficult to discuss them outside of that class-specific context. I already talked a little bit about Charm Monster when I talked about Dominate, and the only reason I'm going to mention it again here is just because technically anyone can get access to Charm's Monster staffs throughout the dungeon, although there is no way to get the book, as far as I know. Not without cheating anyway, or starting as a Mesmer, obviously. So overall, this is it. Like, these are the spells that pretty much everyone has access to, except for a couple that I don't really know about, but that are on the guide list specifically. So, if I missed any that are really that important, that are not on this list, I guess I could try updating the list, making my own tier list here and adding some of the other spells in. But overall, I think that this is fine. I think that this lists all the really important ones anyway. Most of the others are just, like I said, so intrinsically tied to their class. It wouldn't really make sense for me to talk about them compared to these generic, kind of general spells. As you can see, though, I do think most spells fall into the mid category. That's not an insult. I think that they're all pretty good. Generally speaking, when I look at this, I see, like, yes, all of these are spells I'm excited to get. These are spells I'm okay with getting. These are spells that are fine but not exciting, and these are spells that I don't really care about. These spells are obviously bonkers and fantastic. The only change I might be willing to make would be putting Bloodletting in as an S tier damage spell, but I think it's better down here. I think that utility generally trumps out on raw damage. and the only exceptions to that are things like the slow spell and the cure ailment and stuff like that that just give bonuses that you don't really have to care about that much in the game. But yeah, that's it. That's the spells. Next up, here in a couple days, I will be releasing a skill tier list as well, I believe. Which is honestly going to be a little bit more for fun than anything, because all of the skills in the game are good in some way or another. I hope that this helped you guys out a little bit. The biggest takeaway, I think, is that Dominate needs a little bit of a rebalance. It's too good, and the rest of Magic is pretty solid, but yeah, Dominate just overshadows all of it, in my opinion. I also think, if you guys are interested, that I will do a video that kind of covers some changes I'd like to see to Barony from my own point of view. I love Barony as is, but there's some stuff that I would really like to see in it. I think that making a video about that might be kind of fun, talk about some of that stuff with you guys. But either way, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And tune in here in another couple of days for yet another Barony tier list, where I talk for far too long about this game for presumably children. It's a bit hard for kids, whatever. Either way, catch you next time.